An alien distress signal summoned the most feared fleet of the Deathworlders. I was eating cold noodles out of a metal container when 17 alien languages started screaming through my console at the same time. Not one, not two, 17. The ship's translation system groaned under the weight of it. I watched the processing bar on my screen crawl forward like it was in physical pain, trying to sort through layers of sound that were not meant to exist on top of each other. Someone out there had fired a distress beacon set to broadcast on every known frequency at once. That is not something you do when you want help. That is something you do when you are completely certain you are about to die and you want someone, anyone in the entire galaxy, to know it happened. The noodles went cold and I forgot about them. My name is Nora Vasquez. I hold the rank of Commander in the United Earth Space Corps, and I am the commanding officer of the U.S. Relentless, the flagship of Warden Fleet. We had been patrolling the outer edge of the Kepler Expanse for 11 days. The Kepler Expanse is a stretch of dead space that most civilizations avoid, because there is nothing out here worth finding, and the navigation hazards are not worth the trouble. It is, in short, the kind of place you send a fleet when you want them close to the edge of explored space, without making anyone nervous. The 8 ships of Warden Fleet were not the kind of ships you sent somewhere peaceful. They were not diplomacy vessels. They were not science ships or survey craft. They were response vessels, built wide and heavy, and armed in ways that made Galactic Council observers uncomfortable whenever they came to inspect. Warden Fleet existed for one purpose: to go where other assets could not or would not, and to handle situations that other options had already failed to handle. We had not been sent out here because things were calm. We had been sent out here because the region had been growing strange for months, and Fleet Command wanted eyes on it that were also capable of being teeth. My communications officer, a sharp young man named Callum Drake, was the one who pulled the signal apart. He had dark circles under his eyes from a long watch shift, but his hands moved fast and certain across his console. He isolated the dominant language layer first, ran it through the universal base translator, and then looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, something between disbelief and genuine unease. "Commander," he said, "it's a civilian distress call. Mass casualty event. Active engagement ongoing. Species self-identified as the Vane. Population center under direct attack." He paused. "Signal origin is 11 hours old." 11 hours. I set down my container of noodles. "Location," I said. He told me. I looked at the galactic chart on the main display. The signal was coming from inside the Threshold Expanse, a region that every major civilized power in the galaxy had agreed, through 3 separate treaty frameworks, to designate as a sovereignty exclusion zone. No military vessels, no armed ships of any kind. Entry required a multi-body council vote, with representation from at least 9 member species, and that process took no less than 3 weeks when it moved quickly. 3 weeks, and the signal was already 11 hours old. I pulled up the Galactic Council Charter on my personal screen and started reading. My executive officer, a big quiet man named Owen Garrett, came to stand beside me. Owen had been with me for 6 years. He had the kind of face that did not change much regardless of circumstances, which I had always found deeply reassuring. He read the same text I was reading. "Article 7, I said. "I see it," he said. The language was buried in a subsection of the Emergency Response Addendum, added 30 years ago, after a colony disaster, that the Council had been too slow to respond to. It read, "In cases of verified civilian mass casualty events of confirmed or probable alien aggressor origin, first response vessels are exempt from exclusion zone entry restrictions for a response window not to exceed 72 hours. The exemption applies to vessels actively responding to the verified distress event and does not extend to offensive operations beyond the scope of civilian protection." I read it twice. Then I looked at Callum. "Send a message to Fleet Command," I said. "Tell them we are receiving a distress signal from inside the Threshold Expanse, civilian origin, mass casualty classification, and we are exercising Article 7 of the Emergency Response Addendum to the Galactic Charter. Reference signal log timestamp." I waited while he typed, then cut outgoing communications. Callum's hands paused over his keyboard. He looked at me. "Cut them," I said. "We will not be receiving instructions that tell us to wait." He sent the message. He cut the comms. Owen said nothing. He had known me long enough to understand that when I found the legal path to do the right thing, I did not leave the door open for someone to close it behind me. I opened a channel to the other 7 ships of Warden Fleet, scattered across the patrol grid of the Expanse. I did not say anything complicated. I sent the Warden code, a short encrypted signal that every captain in the fleet knew by heart. It meant, stop everything, reform on my position, we are moving. Within 4 minutes, all 7 ships had confirmed receipt. I looked at the navigation display as the fleet began to pull together, engines shifting, formation tightening. The FTL drives would need time to calculate the jump. The threshold expanse was not a short distance. Owen leaned against the console beside me with his arms crossed. The council is going to be very unhappy, he said. His voice was completely level. They will be unhappy with us for a few weeks, I said. The van will be gone forever if we do not move. He nodded once. He did not argue. That was the thing about Owen Garrett. He was not the kind of man who argued about the right thing to do once it was clear. The drives spooled. The fleet formed up around the Relentless, 7 ships pulling in like a fist closing. On my screen, the distress signal was still broadcasting, still cycling through 17 languages, still carrying that single word that every species in the known galaxy used when nothing else was left. Help. I finished my cold noodles while the jump calculations completed. I am not sure why. Some habits do not break even in the middle of everything. The signal kept cycling. The drives reached full charge. I gave the order. The stars stretched and disappeared. We came out of the jump into chaos. I had been in combat situations before. I had responded to piracy events and colony crises and 2 separate incidents that were technically classified and which I am not permitted to discuss in any official record. I knew what a damaged system looked like when you dropped into it without warning. This was worse than anything I had seen. The Vane home system spread across our sensors in fragments. Where the navigation charts showed a network of orbital platforms and relay stations, there was debris, clouds of it, spinning slow and silent, catching the light of the system's pale blue star. 3 of the Vane colony moons had been scorched from above, long black burn lines crossing their surfaces in patterns that were too precise to be natural and too widespread to be anything but deliberate. Entire sections of the orbital grid were simply gone. And in front of their home planet, 40 Vane warships sat in a defensive shell. I want to describe something that is difficult to put into words. A warship with weapons powered down, in the middle of a conflict zone, is not a neutral thing. It is not a ship that has chosen peace. It is a ship that has chosen to place its body in front of something it cannot protect and absorb whatever comes next. Those 40 ships were not fighting. They were standing still with their guns cold and their shields shaped inward, trying to cover as much of the planet behind them as they could. They were prepared to die in place. They had given up on winning. Callum was already working the communications panel before I said anything. A Vane response came through within seconds, which told me they had been watching for any incoming signal and had a reply queued and ready. The holographic display above my console, filled with the image of a Vane commander. The Vane are tall and thin, with 6 limbs arranged in 2 pairs of arms and 1 pair of legs, and their eyes are compound, taking up most of the upper half of their face. They communicate partly through movement of their secondary arms and partly through vocalization, and their translator technology is good, though clearly not calibrated for human vocal patterns. The commander on my screen was older. His exoskeleton plating had the faded, slightly worn look of age, and he held himself very still in the way that I had come to understand meant extreme emotional control in species that used physical stillness as a coping response. He said, in careful translated standard, "You are the Deathworlders." Not a question, a recognition. "We are," I said. "I did not believe you would come." He paused. "I did not believe any of the signals would reach anyone in time. We sent them on every frequency we had, because we had nothing else left to try." "We received it," I said. "Tell me what we are dealing with." His name was Siveth. He had been the commander of the Vane Planetary Defense Force for 19 years. He told me about the Vrethkai in a voice that was steady and quiet, and carried the particular flatness of someone describing something they have already grieved. The Vrethkai were not conquerors. That was the important thing to understand first. Conquerors want something from you that requires you to remain alive and functional. The Vrethkai were something different. They were a nomadic fleet civilization, which meant they had no home system, no fixed territory, no planet. They moved through the galaxy in a formation of ships that was also their entire society, and they sustained themselves by targeting civilizations they identified as technologically developed enough to be worth stripping. They did not want the people, they wanted the infrastructure, the orbital platforms, the manufacturing stations, the energy arrays, the communication networks. They would descend on a system, eliminate any resistance, and then spend weeks dismantling everything built in orbit before moving on. They left the planet's surface alone, mostly. There was not much on a planetary surface that was worth the effort of extracting. They had been doing this for over 300 years, to more than 20 civilizations. No one had ever stopped them. The Vrethkai fleet that had targeted the vein numbered over 200 ships. Siveth told me this without any change in his expression. He had had time to absorb the number. It had stopped being shocking and had become simply a fact, the way the end of something becomes a fact once you have accepted it. "You are 8 ships," he said, and his voice carried something that was not accusation and was not pity. It was closer to apology. "We did not call you to fight them. We do not believe that is possible. We called you because—" He stopped. "We called you because we wanted someone to know, someone to carry the record of what we were. The Vrethkai do not leave witnesses, but they do not pursue vessels that flee before engagement. You could leave. You could take the record of the Vane people with you." He was asking me to attend a funeral. I looked at my crew. Owen was watching me with that still, patient face. Callum had stopped typing and was listening. Lieutenant Priya Holt at the tactical station had her jaw set in a line I recognized. These were not people who had joined Warden Fleet because they wanted to watch things end. I turned back to the display. "Elder Captain Siveth," I said, "I need you to pull your fleet back behind the third moon. Take a low orbit position on the far side and hold there." A long silence. "You intend to engage them," he said. "I intend to stop them," I said. "There is a difference." "You are 8 ships," he said again, and now there was something else in his voice, something that was trying very hard not to be hope, because hope at that point felt more dangerous than despair. "They are 200. They have never fought humans before," I said. "That is the only advantage I need." He looked at me for a long moment through the display. His secondary arms, the smaller pair folded against his midsection, moved slightly. I did not know enough Vane body language to read it precisely, but something in his posture changed. "We will move to the third moon," he said. The channel closed. Owen came to stand at my shoulder and looked at the tactical display, where the Vrethkai fleet signatures were registering at the outer edge of the system. They were approximately 4 hours out, moving in formation. Unhurried. Why would they hurry? They had never needed to. 4 hours, he said. 3.5 by the time we are set up, I said. Get me the other captains on a command channel. And Owen. He looked at me. Tell engineering I want the drives running at full output in 90 minutes. Not cruise output. Full. He smiled, which on Owen Garrett was a small and quiet thing. They will love that. They always do, I said. I pulled up the tactical display and started working. The Vrethkai were 200 ships. They had 3 centuries of experience burning civilizations that fought the way civilized beings fight. They had never, in all of that time, made one particular mistake. They had never made the mistake of fighting something that was not civilized in the way they expected. I was about to teach them the difference. The Vrethkai fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the outer edge of the Vane system in a formation that was, I will admit, impressive to look at. 212 ships, organized in a wide cone pattern, point forward. The lead elements were their heaviest vessels, massive things that read on our sensors as dense with armor and weapon systems, designed to absorb the opening exchange and let the fleet push through any defensive line. Behind them, the main body fanned out in overlapping arcs, with lighter and faster ships on the outer edges to prevent flanking maneuvers. It was a formation that had probably worked very well for 300 years. It was also a formation built entirely around the assumption that the enemy would hold a fixed defensive position. I had split Warden Fleet before they arrived. 2 ships, the Ardent and the Long Road, had left 3 hours earlier on a wide looping trajectory that took them far around the system's blue star. They were now on the far side, moving fast, using the star's gravity to accelerate. The star's radiation would mask their heat signatures almost completely. 2 more ships, the Harrow and the Sentinel, had gone below the plane of the ecliptic, dropping deep before cutting their drives and going silent. They had been sitting dark and cold for 2 hours, invisible to any passive scan. That left 4 ships, including the Relentless, holding position in open space between the Vrethkai fleet and the Vane home planet. Visible, obvious, apparently all that was left. The Vrethkai commander hailed us within minutes of arrival. His image filled my display, and I took a moment to look at him. The Vrethkai are large, built for a high-gravity world, with heavy bone structure and thick plating across their upper bodies that I suspected was partly natural and partly augmented. Their commander wore armor that was elaborately marked in a way that probably communicated rank and history in their culture. He was clearly accustomed to having people recognize immediately what those markings meant. His name, the translation system informed me, was something that rendered approximately as War Speaker Draven. I decided to call him that. "You are 8 ships," he said. His tone was not angry. It was almost amused. "This system was defended by 40. We destroyed the station network and damaged their fleet, and they withdrew. You arrived after that, with 8 ships." He paused. "Identify your purpose. If you are here to negotiate terms of surrender for the planetary population, we will hear the offer. If you are here for anything else, you are making an error." I looked at him for a moment. Behind me, I could hear Owen moving quietly, and the low sound of Priya running final checks on the tactical board. "We have a saying on Earth," I told him. "The early bird catches the worm. Do you know what a worm is?" He did not answer. "It is a small creature that lives in the ground," I said. "Not impressive on its own. But Earth has approximately 1 million species that think worms are extremely interesting, and most of them have teeth." I let that sit for a second. "We are the early birds, War Speaker, and you are very, very far from home." I cut the channel. "Priya," I said. "Ready," she said. "All ships," I said into the command channel. "Execute." What the Vrethkai saw next was something their 3 centuries of combat experience had never prepared them for. 4 human ships, outnumbered 50 to 1, accelerated directly toward their fleet. Not defensively, not carefully. They pushed their engines to maximum output and drove straight at the Vrethkai formation, at a speed that made the incoming fire from the lead Vrethkai vessels almost irrelevant, because we were inside their minimum targeting adjustment range before half their guns had fully oriented. The Vrethkai formation did what any sensible military force does when an enemy charges directly into it. It reacted. Ships adjusted, trying to bring weapons to bear on targets that were now threading through the gaps in their own formation, turning a clean cone shape into something that was folding in on itself. The lead heavy vessels, designed to absorb an opening exchange from a fixed defensive line, found themselves trying to track fast-moving ships that were now behind them. Ships that were behind them had to be careful not to hit ships that were in front of them. The formation, in short, lost coherence within the first 3 minutes. That was when the Ardent and the Long Road came around the star. They were hot. That is the only word for it. They had used the star's gravity to accelerate beyond what their drives alone could achieve, and they had been angled carefully so that the star itself was directly behind them from the Vrethkai perspective. They came out of that glare like something launched from a slingshot, already firing, and hit the Vrethkai formation from a direction it had 0 defensive assets pointed toward. 12 Vrethkai ships were gone in the first 40 seconds. The Vrethkai fleet did what large fleets do when they are hit from multiple unexpected directions. They tried to reorganize. The outer ring vessels began to swing wide to address the new threat. The main bodies started to compress inward to reform the cone. It was the correct tactical response. It was also exactly what I needed them to do, because compressing inward meant they were no longer watching below. The Harrow and the Sentinel came up from beneath the ecliptic at a shallow angle, hitting the underside of the Vrethkai formation, precisely where the reorganization had created the thinnest coverage. They were not firing heavy weapons at full power. They were firing at the engine sections of as many ships as they could reach, methodically, ship after ship, not trying to destroy but trying to cripple. A crippled ship cannot maneuver. A ship that cannot maneuver in a crowded formation is a hazard to the ships around it. In 20 minutes, the Vrethkai fleet had gone from a precise and overwhelming military force to something that resembled a very large argument between 200 ships trying to avoid hitting each other. I looked at Owen. "Tell me about the flagship." He pointed to the sensor display. The largest Vrethkai vessel, War Speaker Draven's command ship, had pulled back toward the rear of the formation during the chaos. It was still intact, still coordinating what response the fleet was managing to put together. It was also, now that the formation had broken apart, not surrounded by nearly as many friendly ships as it had been. "Callum," I said, "get me a direct line to the Ardent." Captain Lucy Farrow's face appeared on my secondary display. She was focused and sharp, and there was a small cut above her left eyebrow that she had not bothered to address. "Commander." "The flagship is exposed," I said. "I am taking a boarding team across. I need you to keep their support vessels occupied for the next 20 minutes. A very brief pause. "Understood," she said. "We'll be loud." I left Owen on the bridge and went to the boarding bay. I should explain something about human boarding tactics, because they are not well known outside of humanity's military community, and the Vrethkai in particular had never encountered them. Most species do not board enemy vessels in active combat. It is considered extremely risky, and it is, but it is also something that humans have been practicing in one form or another since we built the first ships that sailed on water. We have centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to move through an enemy vessel, how to use its own structure against the people defending it, how to operate in close quarters where bigger does not always mean better. My boarding team was 11 people. I was one of them. We crossed in a transport pod that the Vrethkai did not target because they were dealing with 3 human ships that were currently making their outer defense layer very unhappy. We attached to the hull of the Vrethkai flagship on the underside, where the sensor array coverage had a gap that Priya had identified during the opening engagement. The hull cutter took 40 seconds. The inner door took another 20. And then we were inside. The Vrethkai flagship was built for Vrethkai bodies, which meant the corridors were tall and wide. That worked in our favor more than against us. We moved fast, using a route that one of my team members, a quiet, intense young woman named Carla Webb, who had the specific talent for reading unfamiliar ship layouts, had been working out on her tablet since we attached to the hull. She pointed, we moved, and we did not stop moving. We encountered Vrethkai crew members in the corridors. Those encounters were brief and one-sided. I will say only that humans are the product of a world that spent 4 billion years testing what works, and that the things that work are not always the things that look impressive from the outside. We are not the largest species. We are not the strongest, but we are relentless in the most literal sense of the word, and we have a tolerance for the chaos of close combat that most species find genuinely alarming when they first encounter it. We reached the command center in 11 minutes. War Speaker Draven was there, and he was exactly as large as his image had suggested. He had a weapon raised. So did the 6 crew members still at their stations. I looked at him across the command center of his flagship, and he looked at me, and I could see him trying to calculate something. He had the numbers. He had the size advantage. He had 6 crew with weapons pointed at 11 humans who had just come through his door. What he did not have was the context to understand what 11 humans who had just crossed open space to board his ship in the middle of a battle were or were not afraid of. "You boarded my vessel," he said, "in the middle of a fleet engagement, with 11 soldiers. 12 seemed excessive," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "What are you?" "We're the people who answered the signal," I said. "Put down the weapon, War Speaker. Your fleet is already broken. 3 of your heaviest ships are gone. Your formation has collapsed, and you are standing in a room with humans who came here on purpose." He looked at the tactical readout on his console. He could see his fleet's status. He had been watching it fall apart for the last 20 minutes. He was not stupid. Stubborn, yes. Arrogant, yes, but not stupid. He put down the weapon. Not because he was afraid of me personally, though I think some part of him was beginning to understand that he probably should be. He put it down because the situation was simply and clearly over, and 300 years of hard practical experience had taught him to recognize when that was true. I put my hand on my earpiece. "Owen," I said. "The fleet is in full dispersal," Owen said in my ear. His voice was perfectly calm. 68 vessels non-functional or destroyed. The remainder are breaking formation and pulling back. No coordinated pursuit toward the planet. I looked at War Speaker Draven. Tell them to stop, I said. He stared at me. Tell your fleet to hold position, I said. No further engagement. No movement toward the planet. You do that, and this ends here. A very long pause, and then he turned to his communications officer and spoke in his own language. The Vrethkai fleet stopped. I stood in the captured command center of a flagship belonging to a force that had burned 23 civilizations, and I thought about the 11 people behind me, and the Vane fleet sitting behind the third moon, and 4 billion people on a planet that was still there. Owen, I said, status on our ships. All 8 functional. The Harrow and Long Road took damage to their outer hull sections. No breaches. No fatalities. I let out a slow breath. Embarrassing for them, I said, mostly to myself. The Ven came out from behind the third moon slowly, like people who were not entirely sure the danger was over, and were not willing to fully believe it until they had seen it with their own eyes. I understood that. I did not rush them. We brought War Speaker Draven and his senior officers aboard the Relentless, under guard, and secured the Vrethkai flagship with a small crew. The Vrethkai fleet sat at the edge of the system, stationary, not moving. They were not going to move. 300 years of burning through the galaxy had not prepared them for what had just happened, and a fleet that has had its understanding of the world shattered needs time before it decides what to do next. Siveth contacted me 2 hours after the engagement ended. He looked different on the display. Not physically different. The same tall, thin frame, the same aged exoskeleton plating, the same compound eyes. But something in his posture had changed in a way I could not immediately describe. He looked like a person who had been holding their breath for a very long time and had just, cautiously, exhaled. You stopped them, he said. We stopped them, I said. In 8 ships, he said. 8 ships crewed by humans, I said. There is a distinction. He was quiet for a moment. Will you come to the surface? I think my people would. He paused. I think it would be meaningful to them to see you in person. We went to the surface. Vane Prime was beautiful in a way that I had not expected. I had seen the orbital damage from space, and had expected the planet below to carry that same sense of harm. But the surface had not been touched. The Vrethkai had no interest in surfaces. What they wanted was in orbit, and the orbit was now debris. But the planet itself was green and amber under a sky that ran through shades of gold and pale orange depending on the time of day. The cities were built in geometric networks, very ordered, very precise, the kind of architecture that spoke to a species that thought in connected systems and valued the visual expression of how things related to each other. Vane people stood in open spaces and on elevated platforms and in the windows of their buildings, watching us arrive. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They watched. I had read about this response in the anthropological notes on first contact events. Some species, when rescued from a situation they had fully accepted as their ending, do not know how to express what they feel. The experience has moved too far beyond the normal range of their emotional vocabulary. They watch instead, because watching is the only thing that feels accurate. Siveth met us at the landing platform. He was indeed smaller in person than he appeared on the holographic display, and older, and he moved with a careful deliberateness that I recognized as someone managing discomfort they did not want to show. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. 312 years, he said. That is how long the Vrethkai have operated in this region of space. 23 civilizations before us. No one stopped them. Nobody tried the right way, I said. He tilted his head. What is the right way? You stop assuming the other side fights the same way you do, I said. The Vrethkai had 300 years of experience against species that have military traditions, rules of engagement, defined formations and signals and protocols, species that fight the way a civilization fights, with restraint and structure. I paused. Humans evolved from prey animals on a planet that tried very sincerely to end us for about 300,000 years. We never entirely lost the habits that kept us alive during that period. Siveth processed this. Around us, his people were still watching. A group of young Vane, what I guessed to be the equivalent of adolescents, had gathered at the edge of the platform and were looking at my team with enormous compound eyes that took in everything without blinking. One of them spoke. The translator gave me the words a second later. Your world has gravity that would injure us. Your atmosphere has things in it that would make us sick. Your wildlife actively attempts to harm you. How do you survive there? Owen, standing at my shoulder, made a quiet sound that on anyone else might have been a laugh. He covered it smoothly. Practice, I said, and a great deal of stubbornness. We spent 2 days on Vane Prime. I want to be honest, that those 2 days were not only warm and grateful and full of meaningful exchanges, because that would not be accurate, and I do not believe in leaving things out of a record, because they are uncomfortable. There was warmth, yes, and genuine gratitude that I found difficult to receive gracefully, because gratitude on that scale does not fit inside a normal human interaction. But there were also 2 days of working through what had happened, what it meant, and what was waiting underneath the surface of it. The intelligence team from the Relentless had been working on the Vrethkai flagship's data systems since we secured it, with assistance from 2 Vrethkai crew members who decided, with some encouragement, to cooperate with the analysis. What they found was not reassuring. My intelligence officer, a precise and thoughtful man named Grant Ellison, came to me on the evening of the first day with a data pad and a face that told me before he spoke that the information was not going to make anything simpler. The Vrethkai were not acting independently, he said. There are transaction records in their system, encoded but not well enough. Someone hired them, contracted them for this specific target. The Vrethkai were chosen by a third party, and the Vrethkai were engaged to carry out the operation. I looked at him. Do we have an identification on the third party? Partial. The Vrethkai apparently do not know much about who they deal with, just communication protocols and payment structures, but there is a name in the records. In Vrethkai script. He handed me the pad. The translation is approximate. The closest rendering in standard is, the Architects of Silence. I held the pad and read the name twice. No match in the Galactic Species Registry, Grant said. No match in any intelligence database we have access to. Whoever they are not known to us. They are known to someone, I said. You do not get a name like that without a history behind it. That is what concerns me, he said. I spent that night in the small room Sivith had provided for my use, which was sized for a Vane body, and therefore about 30% too tall and 30% too narrow for comfort, and I sat on the edge of a surface that was meant to be a resting place and looked at the data pad and thought, the Vrethkai were a problem we had handled. They were not the problem. They were a tool, and a tool means there is a hand behind it. I thought about 23 civilizations that were no longer what they had been. I thought about how you destabilize a region of space over 300 years without anyone putting the pattern together clearly enough to act on it. I thought about what kind of patience that required and what kind of long-term planning it represented. In the morning, I told Sivith. He sat with it quietly for a long time. Then he said, "What will you do?" "Report it," I said. "Share the data with our intelligence services and with our allies. Investigate." I paused. "And make sure whoever they are understands that the Ven are not an available target anymore." He looked at me. "You would protect us." "You called," I said. We answered. That is not a temporary arrangement. When I returned to the Relentless, there was a large queue of messages from Fleet Command waiting for me. I sorted through them in order of escalating intensity. The first was formal notification that my Article 7 claim was being reviewed. The second was a request for a full operational report. The third, fourth, and fifth were increasingly pointed inquiries about why my outgoing communications had been cut during the response window. The sixth was from the Secretary of Defense directly, which was unusual enough that I opened it first, despite its position in the queue. It was short. It said, "The Galactic Council is in session. Your name has come up repeatedly. I will need a full accounting within 48 hours. Also, well done. Do not repeat this without prior authorization. Rao." I wrote the accounting. I sent it. I left the part about the Architects of Silence for a separate, classified report that I flagged for immediate high-level attention. Then I sat back and looked at the stars outside my window and thought about signals and who sends them and who has been arranging for a very long time to make sure certain signals never get answered. We stayed at Vane Prime for 4 more days, while the most urgent repairs to the Harrow and the Long Road were completed. During that time, the Vane government filed a formal petition with the Galactic Council requesting human protective status, and Sivith came aboard the Relentless twice, which he seemed to find both unsettling and fascinating. The ship was built for humans, which meant it was built compact and low-ceilinged, and organized in ways that seemed chaotic to Vane's spatial logic but were, he came to accept, actually quite efficient. On the last morning, he found me on the observation deck, which is a small room at the forward section of the ship, with a transparent panel that looks directly out into space. "Will you come back?" he asked. "If we call again?" I looked at the stars. The Veen planet was visible as a amber-lit curve below us, alive and present, and exactly where it should be. "We do not leave signals unanswered," I said. "I do not think we are capable of it." He made a movement with his secondary arms that the translation system did not convert to words, but which I understood anyway. The Warden fleet formed up around the Relentless, and we left. Within 6 days of the engagement at Ven Prime, recordings of the battle had reached 43 separate star systems. I know this because Fleet Command sent me the distribution report, which included a note at the bottom that read, "You have made a significant impression on the galactic community. Please be advised that the Commander's Conduct Review Board meets in 3 weeks." The report was signed by 2 different admirals and carried 7 classification stamps, which suggested that a great many people in positions of authority had opinions about what I had done and were still working out how to express them formally. I filed the report in the folder I kept for things that needed attention but not immediate attention, and I started preparing for what was coming next. What was coming next was the Galactic Council. Conclave Station is a large neutral platform, positioned in open space, at a point that is equidistant, more or less, from 6 major civilizations. It has been the meeting place of the Galactic Council for about 140 years, and it shows that history in layers. The older sections are built in the architectural styles of species that were prominent a century ago, and are less prominent now. The newer sections are sleeker and more deliberate. The whole thing is roughly the size of a small moon, and smells, in the sections where multiple species breathe the same circulated air, like a complicated argument. I arrived with Owen and Grant and our legal officer, a calm woman named Petra Cross who had spent 12 years working on exactly the kind of jurisdictional questions that were about to be raised, and who had spent the transit to Conclave Station reading the Article 7 case law with the focused enjoyment of someone who genuinely loved this particular kind of problem. The council chamber was full. I had been in the council chamber twice before, both times as part of a larger delegation, and never as the subject of the session. This was different. The gallery above the main floor was packed with observers from species I recognized, and several I did not. Every seat in the main council ring was occupied. The chamber had the particular quality of charged silence that large groups produce when they are all paying very close attention to something. The presiding chair that session was held by a Keth council member named Varath, who was known for being precise and fair, and for having a very low tolerance for what he called performative outrage. I had encountered him once before at a trade policy session, and had found him reasonable. He called the session to order, and let the opening statements run, and I sat in the response chair and listened. Several council members were genuinely furious. The representative from the Sarathi Commonwealth delivered a statement about the sanctity of the exclusion zone that lasted 14 minutes and included 3 references to specific incidents from the last century where unilateral military action had caused cascading diplomatic problems. She was not wrong about any of the incidents she cited. She was simply working from a framework that did not account for distress signals and 72-hour response windows and 4 billion lives. Others were frightened, which came out as anger but was clearly something else underneath. 8 human ships had just ended a 300-year pattern of destruction that the Galactic Council had failed to address, partly because it kept happening inside zones where intervention was restricted. The implications of that were uncomfortable for people who had invested considerable energy in those restrictions, and some were quiet. The quiet ones were the ones I watched. When the opening statements were finished, Varath called on me. I stood up, and I told them what happened. I did not dramatize it. I did not minimize it. I described the signal, the content, the 11-hour delay, the population count, the Article 7 assessment, and the decision. I described the engagement and the outcome. I presented the intelligence finding about the Architects of Silence in the version that had been cleared for full council disclosure, which was less complete than my classified report, but enough to establish the key point. The Vrethkai had been a tool, not an origin. When I finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the representative from a species called the Velarai, a small and very old civilization near the inner arm of the galaxy, raised her hand and said, "The Vrethkai attacked the Vane home system. Were there other targets identified in the data recovered from their vessels?" Grant had prepared for this question. "Yes," I said. 3. All within the threshold expanse region. The chamber absorbed that. The censure motion was raised by the Sarathi representative. It called for a formal reprimand of human military command for unauthorized entry into a sovereignty exclusion zone and unilateral engagement with a third-party conflict. It cited 4 precedents and 2 treaty clauses. It was well constructed. It failed by 11 votes. 6 species voted against it that had previously supported every similar motion in the Council's recent history. I did not know at the time which 6, but I could make educated guesses based on which representatives had been among the quiet ones during the session. Varath looked at me after the vote with an expression that was unreadable in the way that Keth expressions often were, and said, "The Council will be developing a formal framework for first response events of this classification. Your fleet's conduct will serve as the reference case." "Understood," I said. "Try not to create more reference cases before the framework is finished," he said. "I will do my best," I said. I meant it as sincerely as I could manage. Petra Cross, walking beside me out of the chamber, said quietly, "That went better than the realistic estimate suggested." 11 votes better, I said. 11 votes is a significant margin, she said. "Someone did not want us punished," I said. "They wanted us available." She considered that. "The quiet ones." "Yes," I said. Back on the Relentless, I found a private message waiting in my secured personal inbox. It was from the Secretary of Defense. It was short again, which I was coming to understand was her style when the situation had already resolved itself, and she did not need to add to it. It read, "The Vane Mutual Defense Petition has been approved at cabinet level pending council acknowledgement. 3 additional species have made informal contact requesting preliminary security discussions. The intelligence report on the Architects of Silence has been escalated to the highest priority category. Conduct Review Board has been postponed indefinitely. I have one question for you, and I would like an honest answer. If you had to make the same call again, with full knowledge of the diplomatic situation as it now stands, would you?" I read it twice. I thought about the signal. I thought about 11 hours of a civilization screaming into the void in 17 languages because they had run out of everything else. I thought about Sivith's face when the Vrethkai fleet stopped moving. I thought about 4 billion people on an amber-skied planet who were, right now, tonight, alive. I typed back, "Yes," without hesitation. There was never another answer. I sent it, and then sat for a moment in the quiet of my cabin. The Warden fleet was reforming around the Relentless, the 8 ships of the fleet taking up patrol configuration, ready. Outside my window, the stars were dense and enormous, and full of the kind of distance that makes most things feel small. Out there, somewhere, something called the Architects of Silence was old and patient, and had been moving pieces across the galaxy for a very long time without being identified. Out there, species we had never met were making quiet inquiries about whether humans might be willing to talk. Out there, the footage of 8 ships against 200 was still spreading from system to system, carried on communication relays and trading vessels and diplomatic couriers, reaching eyes and sensor arrays and whatever served as eyes for species we had never encountered. The galaxy was recalculating. I had spent enough time in space to understand that the galaxy does not stay still. It never has. Civilizations rise and are pushed down, and sometimes find something that stops the pushing. Patterns run for centuries until something interrupts them. The Vrethkai had been a pattern. 300 years is a long time for a pattern to run before it meets something that does not fit. We did not fit. We have never fit, precisely, into the category that other species expected us to fill. We were too aggressive for creatures that looked the way we looked. We were too persistent for creatures from a world that size. We were too willing to charge things that outnumbered us by a factor of 25 for any reasonable strategic calculation to account for. We were what we were because of where we came from. Earth made us. A world of massive gravity and dense atmosphere, and 4 billion years of evolution that ran every living thing through a continuous test of what survives. We came out of that carrying things in our bones that we did not always understand ourselves, but that showed up with great clarity in moments, like the one above Vane Prime. Owen came to my cabin door and knocked. "Patrol route has been confirmed," he said. "New orders from Fleet Command. Extended range, northern spiral arm boundary." "New signals from that direction?" I asked. "Not yet," he said. "But Command wants us there." "Because if there are signals," I said, "we should be close enough to hear them." "That is my reading of the orders," he said. I stood up and followed him to the bridge. The fleet moved around us, 8 ships finding their formation, engines steady. The northern spiral arm was a long way out. It would take weeks to reach the patrol zone. Weeks of space and quiet and the low hum of a ship that never truly rested. Somewhere out there, in a galaxy that was still learning what we were, something was old and patient and arranging things. Somewhere out there, species were looking at footage of a battle they had not believed was possible, and asking questions they had not known to ask before. Somewhere out there, a distress signal might already be forming, already starting its journey through the frequencies, reaching for anything that might answer. We would be there. Not because someone gave us permission, not because the paperwork was clean, because 11 hours is too long, and 4 billion lives is not a number you calculate and walk away from. And somewhere in the long, difficult history of what we are, a choice was made that we would be the thing that shows up. The drives pushed us forward. The stars rearranged themselves as we accelerated. The northern arm waited, distant and